In the Second World War, they had a thing called a prison ship. So basically a ship for keeping prisoners of war on. And if you ended up on a Nazi prison ship, by all accounts, you were in for a pretty awful time. Now, I found a newspaper article dated February the 22nd, 1940, about a prison ship, a Nazi prison ship, called the Altmark, which has been boarded by the British Navy, and they've rescued just over 300 prisoners. Now, this story starts at the end of 1939 when a handful of British battleships were sunk in the South Atlantic by a German boat called the Graf Spee. The Graf Spee was later scuttled, but the crew from the British ships that were sunk ended up on the Nazi prison ship, the Altmark. So in early 1940, the Altmark is making its way back to Germany, but because it needs to avoid the British blockades of the German ports, it's taking a long route round and it's coming down through the neutral waters of Norway. And this presents a problem for the British. The Germans are denying that there are any prisoners on this ship. They're claiming that it's just a commercial ship. The British are standing by contemplating attacking it or boarding it. But the Germans are accusing the British of breaking international law by undertaking military action in neutral waters. And they claim that the British are trying to drag Norway into the Second World War. So this is creating a tricky problem. Now, the boat had actually been searched several times by the Norwegian Navy, but they obviously hadn't searched it very well because the Germans had managed to hide the prisoners, and the Germans were denying that there were any prisoners on board. They were saying that it was just a commercial ship. So that put Churchill in a really difficult position because he was kind of thinking, you know, if we don't attack this ship or if we don't board this ship, then we're going to lose all these prisoners. They're potentially going to be killed by the Germans. But if we do board it and there are no prisoners on board, then that's really difficult from a diplomatic perspective in terms of our relationship with Norway and in terms of preserving the neutrality of Norway. So the article is titled Hellship Storm, and the first part of this article is really talking about censorship. Because of the sensitivity around this story, the journalists are clearly being prevented from writing everything that they want to write. But he says here, with Nazi propagandists spouting stories that Britain was trying to drag Scandinavia into the war, it was not surprising that Mr. Chamberlain's henchmen at the Censorship Bureau should show such tender concerns for the susceptibilities of the dithering neutral governments of Norway and Sweden. Then it says, at the Admiralty, Winston Churchill had received exciting news. The sleek, converted merchantman Altmark, supply ship to the scuttled Graf Spee, was reported sailing safely homeward in Norway's neutral waters with 303 British prisoners aboard. So then we've got Churchill's problem. If the Altmark was allowed to pass unscathed, the First Lord knew that Dr. Goebbels would be cock-a-hoop with joy. But if it were attacked by the British Navy and found to be carrying no prisoners and no guns, then Mr. Churchill's name would soon be mud. But Britain's naval intelligence had not botched its job. Held prisoner on the 12,000-ton Nazi hell ship, Winston Churchill was assured were men taken off 7 British merchantmen sunk in the South Atlantic before Christmas by the Graf Spee. At Northern Coastal Command Headquarters, a squadron leader was called to the operations room early one morning last week and told that a very special job was on hand. Given a verbal description of the Altmark, he was ordered to find her. He did so. Warned from the Admiralty of the Altmark's position, the destroyer Intrepid raced up and intercepted her south of Egersund on Norway's south coast. At the same time, the destroyers Cossack and Ivanhoe swept up. As soon as they were sighted, Henrik Dow, fat little bearded skipper of the Altmark, scurried for shelter. At 50 miles an hour, the 450,000-pound Cossacks sped after her, smashing through the waves with every fixture chattering. The newly painted Altmark curved into Josing Ford, a narrow inlet not much more than 400 yards long. Onwards raced the slim-stemmed Cossack past the fjord's rocky entrance. Then she received a signal from one of the other vessels. Doubling on her track, she tore back at full speed. Meanwhile, 2 Norwegian gunboats had placed themselves strategically at the fjord's entrance. Signals were exchanged. The captain of one of the gunboats came aboard the Cossack. On the British ship, Captain P.L. Vian took the Norwegian officer to his neat stateroom, offered to place a joint British and Norwegian guard upon the Altmark and escort her back to Bergen where she could be searched, but the Norwegian skipper refused the offer, declaring that the German was unarmed and that he knew nothing of British prisoners aboard her, and that she had been examined at Bergen the day before and given permission to use Norwegian territorial waters on her way home to Germany. Unsatisfied with these assurances, but chary of further action without specific orders, the destroyers steamed slowly away until they were just outside the 3-mile limit. Their radios crackled. A few hours later, they received an order from the Admiralty to rescue the prisoners, whatever the consequences. At 8 o'clock that evening, Captain Vian assembled his men on the deck. "We've got to get those prisoners off," he said. In bright northern moonlight, the Cossack headed for the fjord. With the engine room telegraph set at dead slow, the Cossack cautiously crunched her way towards the Nazi hell ship. The Nazi searchlight stabbed through the gloom to play on the Cossack's hull. When the two vessels were close together, a low-voiced command rang from the German bridge. The Altmark lunged her 12,000 tons astern. A counter-command came from the Cossack. The ship swung sideways and the tanker scraped her full length. There was 8 feet of icy water between the destroyer's forecastle head and the Altmark's quarterdeck. Gathering himself on the bulwark, Jimmy the One, Lieutenant Commander Bradwell Talbot Turner, who was in charge of the boarding party, leapt aboard the enemy. His armed men followed. From the Altmark's poop, an officer took wild aim with his revolver among the boarders, who replied with a volley of fire. Immediately afterwards, they clicked home their bayonets and charged. While the Germans clattered across the iron decks, the engines were reversed and the Altmark made another attempt to ram her enemy. She missed. Her stern crunched onto the rocks and she stuck firmly aground. Down below in the tanker's hull, 303 British prisoners battered at the bulkheads, desperately trying to escape. The first Wombatch knew of the rescue was when they heard the sound of shots. Then, a German pumpman who could speak English and who had been friendly to the prisoners came to a bulkhead, tore off the fastening wire ropes and wrenched the door open. "Englanders, a warship is here, come up," he yelled excitedly. But before the men could squeeze out, a Nazi officer on the bridge drew his revolver and shot that German through the thigh. An Australian fireman gave him a cigarette as he lay bleeding on the decks and then followed his comrades onto the deck. They caught sight only of the tail end of the scrap. As they trooped up on deck, a Marine in a tin hat leaned out of one of the bridge windows and shouted, "Corps blokes, I've captured the ship!" A small party of Germans had escaped from the Altmark and climbed a small hill on shore from which they opened rifle fire on the Cossack. The fire was returned and 2 who were scrambling across the ice to reinforce them were also hit. Another fell into the bitter water and was rescued by 2 Cossack officers. Though artificial respiration was given for an hour, the man died. Before they left, the Cossacks' men shoved their bayonets through every picture of Hitler on the ship. Her work done, the destroyer drew away from the emptied German and nosed down the fjord. The 2 Norwegian gunboats, now reinforced by a 3rd, did not challenge them this time, but the Cossacks' jubilant men yelled, "No prisoners aboard, eh? Well, we've got quite a few aboard now." While the crowds of sightseers lined the shores of Josselin Fjord and stared at the trail of bloodstains which reddened the snow from the grounded Altmark, nearly 120 of the rescued seamen returned to their homes in London, Liverpool and Hull, but the rest were in hospital. The released men told colourful tales of life aboard the hell ship. New Zealander William Wheeler said bitterly, "The captain was a vicious type who deliberately gave us a rotten time. Some of the seamen and the naval ratings were good to us. One was sentenced to 40 days in the prison cell on bread and water for helping a prisoner to drop a message in a bottle overboard, and another was punished for giving us a bit of tobacco. One of the German sailors who used to give us cigarette stubs told us in whispers that he did not agree with Hitler or with the treatment we were given, and that he was a merchant seaman just like us." I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It just shows that not all Germans would have been bad people. They didn't all choose to be living under a Nazi dictatorship. They didn't all choose to be fighting the Second World War. You know, a lot of them would have been forced into it. It's interesting. Rations were pithily described by T.K. Hyde, a refrigerator greaser of South Shields. For breakfast we had 3 slices of black bread with margarine and tea. For dinner there was 1 small condensed milk tin of soup, sometimes 2 tins. The third and last meal of the day was 3 more slices of black bread with margarine and perhaps a small piece of cheese or a piece of brawn, and occasionally, as an alternative, 1 small tin of pilchards between 40 men. 45 men were put in 1 hold compartment with iron hatches, recounted Frederick Thomas. It was a filthy place with no fresh air. Conditions were terrible, and the Germans made us as miserable as they possibly could with their cruel, heartless treatment. The only thing we got on board was a ravenous appetite. While the rescued men were having long-deferred baths and meals, wires hummed between Britain, Norway and Germany. Dr. Heinrich Sahm, the Nazi minister in Oslo, handed an apoplectic protest to the Foreign Office in which he denounced the unheard-of act of violence and protested that the Norwegian government did not grant sufficient protection to the prison ship. In London, the Norwegian minister was instructed to demand that the prisoners be handed over to his government and that damages be paid. The Admiralty stated that when the captain of one of the gunboats remonstrated with Captain Vian, he replied bluntly, "I have orders to fetch these British subjects with or without the permission of the Norwegian government." I mean, it's interesting that even at the height of war, even after the start of the war, there's clearly diplomatic discussions going on. You know, the Germans and the British are talking to each other through their foreign offices, which I kind of imagine would have stopped when war broke out. But Norway was in a tough spot. On the one hand, it could not afford to break off with Britain, its best customer and most reliable friend amongst the big powers. On the other, it dare not annoy Germany too much. So one way for Norway to deal with this impasse is for them to verbally attack both powers impartially. From an Oslo radio station came a denunciation of Nazi methods of sea warfare, in which it was pointed out that the indiscriminate mine-laying and torpedo attacks had sent 47 Norwegian ships to the bottom and killed 278 seamen. To adjust this balance, Carl Joachim Hambro, President of Parliament, fiercely attacked the Cossacks' rescue. The British squadron's action is the most flagrant violation of the territory of any neutral state which has occurred in this war, the bull-necked president declared. It is difficult for us in Norway to understand this insolent and impetuous violation of the sovereign rights of this small country, which by instinct and tradition is the best friend of England. Then came a thinly veiled threat. The moment chosen for this act of violence is quite remarkable. We were on the eve of concluding a trade arrangement with Britain, but there is reason now to fear that the commander of the Cossack has succeeded in obtaining a result which the German Navy, through months of bitter warfare, has been striving for in vain: to stop Norwegian ships from going to England. It is perfectly obvious that after this arrogant violation of Norwegian territory, any discussion of the regulations of trade and shipping between the two countries will have entered a new stage. Hambro's threat was far from practical. More than 25% of Norway's import trade is with Britain. Its next biggest customer is Germany with 13%. Who else would buy the goods if Britain was boycotted, asked experts. In reply to the spate of protests, the British government sent a note to the Premier. The one-time sawmill worker was told that the Altmark's dirty records must have been well known by the Norwegians, who should have given her a thorough search when it was halted off Bergen. Slightly sarcastic was the sentence: His Majesty's government would be grateful for full particulars as to how this search was conducted and what facts were discovered. Second Officer Platten of the Trevanion, so he would have been one of the prisoners, and he declared it incredible that the Norwegians had failed to discover the British prisoners. We tried to attract their attention by making a terrific noise, he told. We shouted and hammered, and some of the men blew SOS signals on whistles. We tied a shirt to a broomstick and waved it, but a German snatched it away. The third officer of the Huntsman, so that would have been another prisoner, had a red ensign, and we waved that until it was torn out of our hands. Then the men threw crockery high into the air so that it fell on the deck with a crash. Finally, the Germans turned on us a powerful fire hose and drove us away from the hatch, threatening us with cudgels. To drown out the noise, they turned on the steam deck winch, and the harder we shouted, the faster they worked it. But in spite of that, I cannot understand how we were not heard. You know, so there's an intimation here that the Norwegians didn't want to find the British prisoners. I mean, maybe they were afraid of upsetting the Germans. So then the Norwegian Parliament has made a statement. Professor Kott claimed that his government had no idea that the Altmark had prisoners aboard, but even had she been a prison warship, he declared that she had the right to navigate Norwegian waters. And then we have Germany's case. Berlin asserted that as the Altmark was an innocent merchantman having no connection whatever with the Graf Spee and carrying no weapons, the Cossack rescue was a scandalous breach of Norwegian neutrality and a mockery of the most elementary laws of international justice. Whilst Adolf Hitler was reported to be having one of his famous fits of hysteria, I mean, it's interesting that that's how the British press are portraying Hitler, you know, one of his famous fits of hysteria. The German Foreign Office made a strong protest to Norway and demanded that Norway must see to it that the Altmark was returned to Germany in exactly the same condition as when she was attacked. Thus, they've sidestepped the fact of having prisoners aboard. But the most ingenious excuse came from Captain Dow, skipper of the Hell ship. He said, in fact, they were not really prisoners at all, but rescued mariners being taken to Germany for internment. And then the British case is set out, which is basically, they're giving two examples from the First World War of where German ships with British prisoners were docked in the United States, and the Americans insisted on their release, and that was in the First World War. And then they say that if the Norwegians claimed that they knew nothing about the pretense of the prisoners aboard the Altmark, a fuller search should nevertheless have been made. And the main British complaint is of Norwegian inactivity. And then Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax has admitted that there was a technical infringement of Norwegian marine territory, but that this weighed little compared with the fact that the German ship had over 300 men aboard under conditions unworthy of a dog. And then it says, while the diplomatic hullabaloo went on between the three capitals, Winston Churchill set the seal of the government approval of the rescue with a signal to the captain. The force under your orders is to be congratulated on having in a single day achieved a double rescue, Britons from captivity and Germans from drowning. So, a diplomatic hullabaloo, but at the end of the day, the rescue of 303 British sailors took precedent. If you enjoy this content, please take a look at my channel, Not History But News. I'm going through a big box full of old newspapers that I found in an attic, and they're full of really interesting things like this. So please take a look, and if you enjoy it, please like and subscribe. Thank you very much.